Today's session is called Enabling Community Investment in New Brunswick, and it's brought to you, as you know, by CEDNet. And we're a national organization of several hundred community organizations and individuals who are working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. And here on the screen, you can see a few of our member logos. Not all, it's a growing organization, and if you're not already a member, we hope that you'll soon join us. We'll talk a bit about that. And here you can see an image of our new website member map. So if you're looking to find members that are close to you, you can check on the map that's located on the website address there. And if you like the session today, consider joining us by becoming a member. Sign up for our free newsletters or follow us on social media. CEDNet has done a number of webinars like this one in recent years. And here's a list of some of the topics that are covered, and they're all on our website, and they're free for members. So again, some really interesting things, so be sure to check those out. Oh yes, and allow me to introduce myself. They've put a picture up here. You know, women always love having a picture up on the website. Not. But I will be the host for the presentation for the webinar today. And we have with us Jeff Harriman, who is a senior analyst, capital markets with the Financial and Consumer Service Commission in New Brunswick. Jeff is a chartered accountant and FCNB's main point of contact for all the full-sale capital market initiatives in New Brunswick. Currently, he's working on a number of programs and initiatives related to FCNB's access to capital focus. Jeff joined FCNB in June 2007 in the Regulatory Affairs Division as a securities analyst, where his responsibilities included financial statement and prospectus reviews. He has experience on several national finance committees. And prior to joining the commission, Jeff worked for 10 years with Deloitte & Touche, LLP, 7 within St. John, and 7 within St. John, sorry about that, Jeff, and 3 in Brisbane, Australia. And we were very happy to have Jeff come back from Australia and work with us on this Community Economic Development Corporation initiative. He's been great to work with. So before we get into the presentation, let's get to know each other a bit better with 2 quick polls of participants. So you should see 2 questions pop up on your screen. And the question number 1 is, how familiar are you with existing policy and research on enabling community investment? And you can see, you can check your box there. I've done extensive reading on the topic. I've explored only some literature on the topic, or I'm completely new to the topic, just so we can get a sense of where the, I guess, knowledge level is of folks that are on the line today. And then question number 2 is, what are you hoping to get out of the webinar today? And you can just write a short answer there, whatever you'd like to say. I'm going to give you just a second to do that. And just while you're answering the questions, just to let you know a bit about what it is that we're going to do in this session today. The focus is on enabling community investment in New Brunswick. And how to do that is a fundamental question for those of us working to support the creation and growth of initiatives with social impact. And since 1999, Nova Scotia has used the model of a Community Economic Development Investment Fund, commonly known as CEDC. And that's capital that's pooled from contributions by individuals, corporations, and trusts within a defined community. And Jeff will talk to you about defined community. and that use business used to fund business development within that same community. New Brunswick is the latest province to implement legislation, and that's through our new Community Economic Development Corporations. And we're very excited about this, as individuals can now purchase shares or securities in CEDCs in their local community to pool resources together to invest in eligible community projects. And CEDCs are controlled by a local group of officers and directors and offer tremendous opportunities for community economic development. Today we're going to learn about what's unique about the New Brunswick model for community investment and some of the key lessons learned in establishing the legislation and a whole bunch more. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Wendy. The Community Economic Development Corporation, we implemented the program in New Brunswick a few months ago. What I hope to kind of talk to you about quickly is FCMB, who we are, my role around developing capital markets, and then, of course, majority of my time will be talking about our specific program, and then Wendy can take me through any questions, or if you guys put questions in the chat box, I'm happy to touch on it. So the FCMB is actually a Crown Corp in the province of New Brunswick, and each province in Canada has its own securities regulator. So if you're in Ontario, you'd have the Ontario Securities Commission. If you're in Vancouver, BC area, you'd be the BC Securities Commission. In New Brunswick, we're known as the FCMB, which is Financial Consumer Services Commission. And that came about because we have a number of mandates and legislations that we would look at. So for example, the area that I focus on is securities. So we have the responsibilities for securities in the province. We also have the responsibilities for pensions, for co-ops, credit unions. We basically have 22 different acts that are our responsibility. And our mandate is actually to protect consumers and enhance public confidence in the financial and consumer marketplaces through the provision of regulatory and education services. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but really what it means is we spend a lot of our time educating people in New Brunswick about our rules and our regulations, trying to help them be informed and prevent them from making mistakes with their resources. And I have a very specific mandate that the Commission has kind of granted to me, and that's kind of developing capital markets in the province. So over the last few years, I've worked on ideas around when a company looks to raise money, you know, who can, who can't invest in them, what are the new ideas. About 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I started looking at the idea of crowdfunding. So I researched ideas like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, peer-to-peer lending, and came to the conclusion that there might be some relevance in the province around doing something called equity crowdfunding, which really means a company going online and selling their shares. So we worked on that for quite a while. One of the ideas that was given to me by our previous chair was that capital markets is broader than what I was looking at, which was mostly small business, a lot of startup, kind of established companies. He really introduced me to the idea of social enterprise, and I know there's a few definitions there for social enterprise, but it's really what I started to look at were organizations that potentially were an actual business or the potential to become a business that were a profitable organization but also did a social good. So one of the ideas that I started to research was the program in Nova Scotia called a CDEF. Their CDEF stands for Community Economic Development Investment Fund. And we looked at that and said, you know, there might be some merit in this idea. We already had a tax credit in the province for small businesses. Maybe we could work with the Department of Finance and see if that could be expanded to include a Community Economic Development Corporation. So surprising to me, in my prior life, I worked for an organization called Deloitte, which was a private accounting firm. So if you had an idea that you wanted to push forward, you sat down with the partners, you pitched it, they would often make the decision relatively quickly, move forward. When I started researching the CEDC, I really liked the idea. I looked at what Nova Scotia was doing, and I spent a lot of time trying to find out if there was ways to either duplicate it or actually try to improve on the process. And I pitched the idea, and it took a couple of years to put together. So I really had some important learning there. And part of it was there are two distinct organizations that are part of the CEDC program. There's, of course, the FCMB, and we put together the rules and regulations that allow companies to sell their shares. And then the Department of Finance put the rules in place to determine if an organization is eligible for an actual tax credit for the investments made into the CEDC. So there was a number of folks involved, and it ended up being a very interesting and great education for me. And it took a little bit of time, but it did come forward. So a community economic development corporation, in its simplest form, is a company that wants to raise money in New Brunswick to do whichever idea they choose to push forward. So a couple of quick examples that we've seen in Nova Scotia, as our program is similar to theirs. They have a number of windmill projects that have run through there. They've had a couple small solar projects. They've got an organization known as Just Us Coffee, and they basically were a group out of the Annapolis Valley who wanted to improve on the coffee experience. They wanted to have organic coffee. They wanted to buy beans from conflict-free zones, but they also wanted their community to be part of this. And so they went out and they developed a CDF, and their investors got involved. They put themselves as a co-op, and they've been running for a number of years. And if you're curious about any of these, most of those organizations are on, have their own unique websites. There's another one known as New Dawn Enterprises out of Cape Breton. They do a number of interesting things. Again, if you wanted to look up New Dawn, it'll give you some interesting examples. So a CEDC really did three things for New Brunswick investors and potential New Brunswick companies. So the basic rule in securities law, and I won't delve too deep into this, but the basic rule is if you want to raise money in the province, you would have to issue something called a prospectus. And a prospectus is put together often by organizations that are quite large, Royal Bank, Bell Canada. In New Brunswick, say, we have a few drilling companies, one known as Major Drilling. They would put a prospectus out that would be provided to anyone interested in buying shares in their organization. The small business across Canada would have a very difficult time issuing shares if they had to put a prospectus together. So we put together pretty much nationwide a number of exemptions that would exempt you from having to create something as significant as a prospectus. So we have one that a lot of people don't even know exists, and it's called a private issuer. And really what that means is a friend, family, or a person that works in the organization or close business associates are allowed to invest in a business, and they can buy shares in that business. FCMB does not get involved day-to-day with those types of transactions. We believe there's an inherent trust between those various individuals, and they're allowed to buy shares. There's another exemption for angel investors. In my world, they're known as accredited investors, but it's basically individuals with a specific net worth that can choose to invest or not to invest in companies across the country. Once you go outside of your friends and family and your close business associates and the angels, it becomes a little bit more complicated because you're basically asking strangers to invest in your company. So the CEDC, what we tried to do was put together some rules and a specific document that you'd have to fill out that says, if I'm going to raise money, and I'm going to raise money from a defined community, and I'll talk about that quickly in a moment, but the goal is to give an individual enough information that they can be an informed investor. that's one of the most important things that I look at and the FCMB cares about, is making sure that an investor in our province is informed and understands what they're investing in. We're not in the business of trying to determine if a company is going to be a successful business or not. If we could do that, obviously, we'd probably be a whole lot wealthier, because you never know. You never know which companies are going to do well or not do well. But the important piece is that a company or a CEDC provides the information that an individual can read, look at, understand, and say, yes, I agree, or I would like to invest, or I don't want to invest. So that's the first thing the CEDC did. It provides a way for individuals who don't know a company or don't know the owners of the company the chance to invest in that particular organization. The second thing it did was it allowed co-ops to get involved. So right now in the province, we have a small business investor tax credit, which basically says if you invest in a small business and they work with the Department of Finance, the person who invests would get a 50% non-refundable tax credit. So in its simplest form, if you invested, say, $1,000 on your next tax return, you would get $500 back. So it is quite a tax credit that's quite generous. It's certainly the most generous that I've seen in the country based on my research, and it's really grabbing individuals' attentions. But co-ops weren't eligible for the small business investor tax credit due to the type of shares they issue. So while we were putting together the CEDC rules, the Department of Finance amended their rules to allow for a co-op, as long as it's a for-profit co-op, to issue shares in that organization, and the individuals would receive a tax credit. So it put them more on even footing. The third thing it did, it allowed for a CEDC to actually set itself up as a fund or as a blind trust or a blind pool. And really what that means is if a group of people in a community get together and they want to raise $100,000, for example, with the stated goal of investing in startup companies in a community or supporting community economic development activities or whatever they feel is appropriate for their organization, as long as, again, it does have to be a for-profit type investment. But again, it's a set of money or a certain amount of money designed for investments that are put together by the board of directors. So I mentioned defined community, and really defined community is the CEDC has to decide what community they wish to sell their shares within. So it can be quite broad. You can say, my defined community is going to be New Brunswick-wide, or it could be, I'm defining my community as people interested in investing in an IT or tech company, or I'm interested in setting up a fund that's going to invest in women entrepreneurs in the province. So the reason the defined community is important is you limit yourself to that community to where you can raise your money, but you also have to elect your board of directors, and the board needs to have at least 6 people, and that board has to come from that defined community. So those are the 3 big things that changed, and what we tried to do was we looked at Nova Scotia's CDIF program, we looked at the prospectus rules, and we tried to pick up the things that were the most important for a CEDC to share with potential investors, and we tried to streamline it so that it was a process that was fairly straightforward and that individuals could really understand the process, and it didn't get too legal or too complex. So who can invest in my CEDC? Anyone in New Brunswick 19 years or older that fit within your defined community can invest. There is some minimums and maximums on that. An individual, the minimum investment is going to be $1,000, and the maximum is $250,000. Can a cooperative participate? I think we talked about that. Certainly a for-profit co-op is allowed to participate, raise money in a brand new co-op or an existing co-op. Does it have to be for profit? Yes, it definitely has to be for profit. So the other piece, which is interesting, and many of the other provinces have the same rule related to this, is can I promote a CEDC, or can I promote the fact that I am trying to raise money? So the answer is actually yes. You're certainly allowed to share this information with individuals. You can go out, and if you choose to, you can set it up through email or Facebook or Twitter or however you feel is appropriate. And you can let people know that you have a project or a CEDC in mind. You're looking for like-minded or people who are interested in this type of idea, and that you have documentation that you'd like to share with them. So you can certainly let people know that it's out there. You're trying to do something new or interesting or grow or develop or whatever it's going to be. What I caution people of is to make sure that they don't get into information where they're making promises or guarantees, or they oversell it, like this is going to be the world's greatest idea, we're going to grow significantly, we're going to have big dividends, we're going to do this, putting all kinds of future statements in there. I would caution folks against that. It really doesn't work within our rules, but you are certainly allowed to let people know that the idea is out there, and you're looking to sit down and talk to them, and you're going to have your CEDC documentation, and however you'd like to put all that together. So those pieces are important. If we could flip to the next slide, maybe. Okay. Is there a minimum number of investors? There are. So a CEDC must have at least 3 investors. We haven't put a maximum on there, obviously, because if a CEDC wishes to raise $100,000 and they wish to have each shareholder own $1,000 in shares, well, you're going to have 100 shareholders. If you're looking to have minimum investments of $10,000, but you want to raise $1 million, again, you could have up to 100 shareholders. You could have many more. The one thing I think that's important, and some entrepreneurs have shared this with me, and I've heard this just kind of through my various conversations, if you're going to do this type of development, you really want to ensure you understand the fact that you're going to have a lot of shareholders and you're going to have a lot of individuals who will be interested in what you're doing, and you need to communicate very, very well with them what you're doing, what's going on, and be respectful of the fact that there could be a lot of shareholders that may have plenty of questions. The maximum amount that can be raised is $3 million. And again, the minimum to be raised has to be $10,000. So what if the CEDC doesn't raise all the money it needs? So if a CEDC says that the minimum raise they're looking to put together is, for example, $50,000 with a maximum of $100,000, if they only raise $45,000, unfortunately for the CEDC, they have to give all that money back to the shareholders. It hasn't met its minimum. If an investor has second thoughts, they sign on the dotted line on a Friday night and are concerned, within 48 hours they are allowed to go back to the CEDC and say, for whatever reason, they've chosen to not move forward with the investment, the CEDC must give them their money back. And income tax considerations, there's 2 sides to that. We talked about the tax credit portion, of course, and if a company sets up and is brand new, just making sure that they sit down with an appropriate tax lawyer to make sure that they understand exactly what they're getting themselves into. There might be one more page of questions. Yeah. So who can sell your securities? That's an important question. The securities within the CEDC can be sold by the owners of the CEDC. If they have some close friends that are talking to people, they can certainly let folks know that there's a CEDC out there. There's information for them to obtain and read, etc. What you want to be careful of is there are people who are registered to sell different types of shares, whatnot, across the country. There are a lot of folks who are, say, a mutual fund salesperson. They are registered only to sell mutual funds. So if you were speaking to someone and to say, I'd like you to help me sell my CEDC shares, you would really have to talk to someone who is an exempt market dealer. There are a lot of exempt market dealers in the larger provinces. We really don't have many in New Brunswick, but again, just keep in mind that if you're looking for folks to help you sell, just make sure that they're considered an exempt market dealer. I haven't talked about this, but if the CEDC is putting all its information together, They're trying to determine whether people are going to be interested in this idea. They haven't gone through the whole process yet with the FCMB. They're still working, say, with the Department of Finance. They can get an individual potential investor to sign what's called an expression of interest form. And all that means is they are interested in this idea and they'd like to have what information is available. It is not a commitment to buy, but at least it can tell the folks looking to put a CEDC together that maybe there's some people interested, we're just floating some information out there, etc. But I think it's important to know that the expression of interest allows them to get the information, but it doesn't mean they're going to buy anything at the end of the day. The application process itself, FCMB has committed to responding to all CEDC applications within 20 business days, and the Department of Finance have stated, because they've come out and presented with me, and they're within 30 business days that they would get back to you. So if the information that we receive is well put together, has all the right information, then it can be a fairly quick turnaround. Obviously, if there's some holes in the documentation or we have some questions, it can extend beyond that, but we certainly would reply within 20 days of the first application. What is a non-objection letter? So once the FCMB have a look at the documentation, we'll read it and make sure that there's adequate information for an individual to read it and hopefully understand it so that they can be an informed investor. So the FCMB would issue a non-objection letter saying we are not objecting to you raising money. We are not endorsing it. We are not saying it's a good investment or a bad investment. But what we believe is there's at least adequate information for an individual investor to be informed. I know I've said that several times, but it certainly is very important. More information, fcmb.ca/CEDC is our website. There is all kinds of good information. We have the rule itself. We have something called a companion policy, and how a companion policy works is it takes some of the sections out of the rule and talks about it in more plain English. We try to write these as plainly as we can, but there is legal requirements in some of the rules. But the companion policy breaks it down and helps explain it a little bit better. We have a Q&A on there. I'm actually working on 3 short videos right now that are going to be going on our website and on YouTube that just talk about the basics. And then there's the non-objection letter, what it would look like, and the expression of interest form. So there's plenty of information. And if someone wants to know about the tax credit side of it, they just have to go to the Department of Finance under their SBITC, which stands for Small Business Investor Tax Credit. So that is the basics. More than happy to go through any questions that come up. And I know, Wendy, you and I have done a few of these together, so if there's something that I haven't touched on that you think I should explain a bit more, I'm happy to do that.
Great. Thanks for that, Jeff. And we are going to move to question period in just a moment, but there were a couple of things I just would like maybe for you to touch on a bit more. Around nonprofits not being eligible to apply as a CEDC, there are ways that nonprofits can set up a CEDC as a for-profit entity. Can you just talk about that for a moment?
Sure. So what I've seen, and it's happened in Nova Scotia, is there are some not-for-profits that have a portion of their not-for-profit that actually is quite profitable depending on what they're doing. So what they'll often do is spin out the for-profit part and make it into a company and run the exact same program, and that organization actually makes money, but a portion of that profit is then given back to the not-for-profit. So that is a model that can potentially work. You'd have to be very explicit to your shareholders that a certain portion of the money will go back into this project. Here's the community good we're doing, etc. But as long as individuals are informed, that makes a big difference.
Great, thanks. Another difference between the Nova Scotia and the New Brunswick model is that in Nova Scotia, a blind fund that's been set up can actually issue debt or loans to, rather than take an equity position, which is currently what's required in New Brunswick. So could you just speak a bit about that as well?
Sure. When the SBITC rules were written, it was very specific in the wording, and they did call it the Small Business Investor Tax Credit, so it really was designed around the investor in mind, and the idea was that the investor was looking to buy shares in a for-profit business. So they were very specific to say you couldn't just set up a company that was going to lend money. They didn't see that as an active business. So when the CEDC rules came in, they stuck to the exact same wording in relation to what you can and can't do with the funds that you're looking to pull together. So they have still not updated any rules related to a CEDC lending money. I can let folks know that there have been several organizations that have specifically spoken to the Department of Finance asking them to reconsider that. And I have no direct insight, but I know they're at least listening and speaking to folks about it.
Okay, great. And just one last question, Jeff, and that's around what's not eligible under the CEDC, and maybe a bit about what active business means.
Sure. So active business is actually a term defined by the Canada Revenue Agency, and it determines whether or not a company is actively building a business or doing something to earn the money that they're collecting. So the best example I can think of would be an individual or a company looking to buy an apartment building. So if the apartment building has 8 units in it and it collects $3,000 or $4,000 a month, and at the end of the year, has a profit of $5,000, that is a profitable organization. But because the company didn't do anything really other than collecting rent, that's not deemed active business by CRA. If you had the same building, but you were running a nursing home, the building is, technically inconsequential in their mind. And what really has happened is you are running a nursing home, and the nursing home is an active business income. So that would be the difference. Certainly, if you had a large building and you were running, some commercial ideas are there, you were running a convenience store or something like that, and you had a number of employees, 5 being kind of somewhat of a magic number, but if you had enough employees involved, they would look at it closely and say potentially that's active business. But that is something that is not the responsibility of the Department of Finance. It is a CRA rule.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much for that, Jeff. So let's move on to question period and invite participants to type your questions into the chat box at the bottom right of your screen. And we're also going to unmute participant phone lines, so you'll be able to talk. But if you'd like to keep your phone muted because of background noise, just remember to use *6. We're also going to uncinch the presentation so that people on the webinar should be able to scroll back through the presentation and review particular slides of interest in case you're trying to remember a question. If you're like me, you're wondering, what was that I wondered on that slide when Jeff said that? All right, folks. So let's go ahead with questions. And I see we've got a couple popping up already. So from Rupert Downing, in BC, the 5 and growing investment co-ops have a tough time with security regulation. They require us to have a regulated investment management and dealer company, an audit requirement that costs $250,000 a year minimum. Are these regulations exempted for CEDCs? Jeff?
Yeah, I'm just reading that question as well. So the CEDC has changed the rules around the fund idea, so I think that's what you're getting at. if you try to do a fund right now in New Brunswick, outside of a CEDC, the insurance rules, the regulatory requirements are quite complex, and those that have looked at doing it before have decided not to do it because the regulatory requirements are quite significant. So with the CEDC rules, we very closely looked at the fund rules and changed it so that a CEDC would be able to put a fund together, and the insurance requirement and some of the regulatory trading environment, and certainly putting in a management or dealer company is not required under the CEDC. So it is quite different. And in Nova Scotia, that's where a number of the CEDCs or their CDIFs have been successful, because they have set up funds this way. So it is quite different than you would see in any other province, excluding New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Okay. From Roger Peters, how does a for-profit co-op participate? Does it have to set up a new CEDC, or can it just act like one, as one?
Yeah, no, that's an important question, and Wendy, you can probably touch on that too. Really, the co-op world can definitely get involved. They issue what's called, it's called a membership share, but at the end of the day, it is just a share in the cooperative. If the co-op does want to get involved, one that already exists, then they will have to come to terms that the information that they've had over the years, their policies and procedures, their financial statements, all need to be looked at, and we don't need a full audit for a CEDC, but you would need a review. And so all that information becomes part of the new CEDC. So what a lot of individuals have looked at doing is setting up a new CEDC with the idea of the CEDC investing in pre-existing co-ops, and they've done it that way. Did you want to add to that, Wendy?
Yeah, well, I would just add a lot of it depends on your legislation and the flexibility in your structure and bylaws. In New Brunswick, our Co-op Act, hasn't been amended since 1976, and it is very restrictive. We actually have a new act coming soon to be approved that will open it up, and actually part of the consideration when we were developing that was the CEDC, and we tried to set it up so that any new co-ops that get established in the future, they won't run into the same kinds of issues that existing co-ops run into. So as Jeff said, the co-ops that we're talking to that are interested in setting them up are thinking about establishing a new one, just mostly because of that consideration. Okay, we have from Rupert again, how about affordable market rental housing development as an eligible business?
Affordable market rental housing. You'll have to help me with that one. I'm not exactly sure what he means.
Would it be similar to what the St. John Community Loans Fund is
I think
doing?
So. Yeah. So initially, if what the CEDC was to do is just have a building that collects rent, even though it is affordable market rent, there is no specific rule that would allow that to come to fruition. Again, I know the Community Loan Fund and others have asked the Department of Finance to consider allowing affordable market rental housing, or he refers to it more as social housing. And again, the Department of Finance is certainly at least discussing the idea, and I don't have insight into how they're moving along. But that's something that's quite unique. I know, Wendy, when you and I we did our provincial tour, I heard that certainly more than once, that if you're going to do community economic development corporations, social housing really needs to be on the docket, or at least considered. So that conversation continues for sure.
Right on. I'm just going to take a break before I read the next question and ask, is there anyone on the line that would like to ask a question by phone?
And just to add to that as well, I have enabled the microphone rights on your computers as well. So if you have a mic in your computer, you should be able to speak up through your computer.
Great. Thanks for that, Matthew. Okay, hearing that, I'm just going to move on to the next written question, and then I'll check in again in a moment to see if there's anyone that wants to speak. This comes from Murray Heidelbaugh. I hope I'm saying your name right, Murray. Can a CEDC fund be used to fund public infrastructure, or are there any similar local investment systems that can be used to finance public municipal services?
That's a great question. That's one I'm going to have to look into a little bit deeper, because there is some restrictions around, under the SBITC, around working with basically putting a company together, raising money, getting a tax credit, and then doing public infrastructure. So that may be a no, but it'll be something I'll have to have a bit more of a search into.
Okay, thanks. So just back to the phones again. Any questions from people on the phone? Okay, so we don't have any more questions in the chat box. I see Mike Toy here is typing. I don't know if that is a question or not, but I'll give folks one last chance if you have any burning questions before we finish up.
Sure. And in the meantime, Wendy, why don't I switch back to the poll just to see if what people were hoping to get out of the webinar today. I did broadcast the results there.
Can I just ask a quick question? It's Rupert here.
Review that to make sure that people are getting what they were hoping to get.
I just wonder, our finance department here in British Columbia has said that the
Reading through here, and
I see one here, how to initiate the process to get the discussion started and potential challenges that need to be considered. I might speak to that, Jeff, and you may have some thoughts around this as well. I think that one of the things that we at the Co-op Council have identified, and so we've been working on this for many years now, and have worked very closely with FCNB and finance, and have sort of become the community contact, and we've done a lot of presentations with Jeff and also just because of demand. And so we find there's a lot of interest and lots of ideas, but groups often tend to get stuck at, well, where do we go from here? How do we organize ourselves? And how do we move this forward? And as many of us know that work in community economic development, our organizations, boards and staff are often, tapped to the limit. And the thought of taking on a large project like this can be pretty daunting. And so one of the things that we've been talking to our government about and getting some support, we're hoping that this may happen, is to actually have a community-based service for at least in the early, years of this, where someone like the Co-op Council can go in with groups and help them, figure out, to help facilitate the discussion and those early kinds of questions that they have, and work a little hands-on with them. We'd also like to develop some tools, so maybe some guides for people, or just forms and so on, so that they're not starting from scratch. And we really like to see, I guess this happened in Nova Scotia, where they announced the CEDC back in, Jeff, what year was it? 98 or 99?
1999, yeah.
And it was years, really, before anyone accessed it. And part of that reason was because all it was kind of on the website. Now, in New Brunswick, FCND is doing a great job of educating and promoting people. But there, I think, is still an important piece at the community level where there is some group that can go in and work hands-on with boards and organizations in the early stages. Was there anything you wanted to add to that about sort of challenges?
Yeah, and I agree with your points. I think where people do get stuck is not everyone wants to be the first out of the gate. They're nervous whether the investors will actually show up. They're not sure what the actual offering document could look like. I mean, we put a lot of the information on our website for people to look at, but in Nova Scotia, there is a couple individuals that are known in that community, so that if you're going to build your CEDC or your CEDC, you would call them, and they, for a fee, will help you go through that process. That infrastructure obviously isn't in place yet, and as a few CEDCs start to come along, I think people will become more comfortable with the process, and we'll start to see some. I mean, currently we have 2 organizations that are working towards having a CEDC live in the province, so we'll see how that goes.
Great. Okay, back to the questions. There's a question here from Roger Peters about the maximum being set at $300,000, and then Brian Siff has responded saying that he thought the maximum was $3 million. And so, Brian, yes, you're correct. It is $3 million cap, and there is a cap of, well, $250,000 investment, but it's not actually a cap. People can invest as much as they want, but the maximum credit that they can receive is $125,000, so that would be 50% of the $250,000.
The other piece, Wendy, is the $3 million is not a lifetime limit. That's a 12-month.
Right.
So if someone raised $3 million in one 12-month period, and they wish to try to raise another $3 million if they had another project, if they were doing, say, another windmill installation, they could do a new CEDC and look to raise up to another $3 million every 12 months.
Right. Which also sort of raises the point around how often a business can apply. And so if they haven't reached their $3 million cap in 1 year, then they could potentially, I'm not sure anybody would do this, but they could potentially apply 2 or even 3 times a year for lesser amounts. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, going on to a question from Rupert Downing. Are the federal attempts to create a standardized national securities regulation going to impact on this? Our finance department in BC is claiming it will make these kinds of exemptions impossible.
That's a great question. Obviously, there's lots of conversation going around about the idea of our cooperative national regulator. New Brunswick has agreed to be part of that if and when it goes forward. I guess the only thing I can say is each province will continue to have the ability to create a local rule. So if this comes together and New Brunswick wants to continue with the CEDC program, we could create a local rule that would allow us to do that. And I don't know the BC rules. I would think there's the possibility that they would have something similar, but they may be waiting to make larger macro decisions until the new organization comes together. But again, I can't speak directly for BC.
Okay. From Murray, when discussing a group, has there been any champion at the local level that should be contacted? Co-op, bank manager, etc. Who might be contacted at the provincial level, not a person but a desk? a first point of contact in a province like Saskatchewan. Jeff, do you want to speak to FCMB's role there?
Yeah. I guess we're a little bit fortunate in New Brunswick. About 5 years ago, they asked me to take on the role of capital market development. So I'm actually nationally the only capital market specialist kind of in the country, and that's simply because New Brunswick looks at our capital market slightly differently, where the vast majority of our companies are private companies. So we've dedicated a lot more effort into that area. If you wanted to talk to someone in the in Saskatchewan or other departments, you would just contact their Securities division and ask to speak to someone about that, and it would probably go to the division head. And I know any province that I've spoken to have people that are certainly open to listen and have good conversation. If you're trying to get specific, the actual area within our rules, our act is known as the 45106 rules. If someone was to say, well, what are you talking about? They're called the exemption rules that allow private companies to raise money. That's kind of the starting point.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've answered all the questions. Mm-hmm.
There is just one that I saw from Mike Toy that I just wanted to flag as well. He said, apart from the issue around affordable housing, are there further changes foreseen for the policy? It's still early, I suppose, but has uptake and interest so far been as expected?
I've had more calls on this than I've had on anything I've worked on to date. When I did the crowdfunding 2 years ago, the entrepreneurs that I spoke to in the community would often use the phrase, if you build it, they will come. I anticipate to see a very significant uptake in crowdfunding, and to date we've seen very little there. On the CEDC side, I am getting way more phone calls from individuals. As I mentioned, there are 2 organizations. No one's done anything formal, but that have been in contact with us asking many questions, and I've probably talked to another 30 or 40 individuals or groups who are contemplating the idea. Certainly would be great to see a few CEDC applications come through, but the conversations that we have and the amount of interest it seems to be brewing is quite interesting.
Yes, and I could just add to that from our level as well. So we get, at least 1, if not 2, contacts a week from groups that are interested, or also from people who are interested in investing, because as this has become a bit more known, there are people that have money to invest here, and they're actually looking for projects to invest in, and at this point in time, we haven't been able to tell them about any, but as Jeff mentioned, there's just so much interest that I expect, and I think, again, those first ones are going to be important, and having, someone maybe that can mentor them a bit through the process and see how it works rather than just hear about it. I think that's going to make a big difference. Now I see it looks like there's a couple of people here typing. We are getting close to the end, but I think we've got a couple of minutes. So Roger is just typing, so we'll give him just a second. Anyone on the phone? No? Okay. So it looks like that's good, folks. So I want to really thank you for all of the great questions and for being with us today. And special thank you to Jeff. He's, as you can tell, he's very passionate about this himself, and he's been an amazing supporter and resource for getting this through. So thanks so much for that, Jeff.
Great. I enjoyed it.
Great. And for the rest of you, if you want to stay in touch around policy-related issues like, community investment legislation, be sure to check out CEDNet's website or sign up for their free emails. And also, you should have just received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. Please take a second and fill it out now. We're always trying to improve on our webinars, and your feedback is really important in knowing what you think we could do better. And thanks to all of you for your participation and your questions. The webinar recording is going to be posted on our website in the coming days, and we'll send you the link as soon as it's available, along with any additional resources. So thanks again, everyone, and take care.